Our next speaker is somebody who has maybe more experience than anyone else in the world. She was the CEO of Ning from its inception for over 6 years, which had over 90 million users and over 300,000 active communities. She's also now the founder of Mighty Bell, another community platform that's really growing. It's another amazing option for companies who are building communities. She's also the co-founder of the Lean In movement. So she's someone with a ton of experience building communities, building businesses, understanding the value of community for businesses, and has seen literally hundreds of thousands of communities and what works to build engagement online for your communities. So please join me in giving a big welcome to Gina Bianchini!
Wow! Thank you guys so much. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to start by saying I think we have the greatest job in the world. When we launched Ning and started to see the different networks pop up, I got goosebumps. We saw things that I never thought that I would have a hand in being able to create and bring together. And I think every single person in this room, if you've created a community before, you see people start to interact in ways that you couldn't have imagined, you just get goosebumps every day. And so when I think about what we do and how we do it, you know, there's so many pieces of it that's about empathy, and it's about connections, and it's about being able to talk to people who are similar to us and different to us, and watch people's creativity just blossom in ways that I could have never expected. And I just think this is the greatest job ever. And so I'm so appreciative of David and you all inviting me here, because to sit in a room with people who do this for a living and who believe in the power of communities is pretty much my Super Bowl. So thank you guys right off the bat. What I want to talk about today is, oops, I went forward. Can I go back? Okay. Is scaling communities. And I want to put forth an assertion that the best way to scale communities is actually to build a network. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk talking about networks and network building. And the way I think about networks and define networks is, you know, there's so many different ways to define a community. And networks, underneath it all, it's about connecting people to each other, connecting the nodes in the network. So I think about when you have followers, for example, it's I talk out at you, you talk back at me, and in many, many cases, no one's talking to each other. I have seen over and over again that the most powerful communities are those where members are establishing and building relationships, not even connections or interactions, but relationships with each other. And I want to put forth that that is the true power of communities and community building. And so when we think about networks and we think about how are we surfacing the most relevant members to each other, how are we breaking the ice, what are we doing to bring people back to message, to meet up, to learn from each other? When that magic happens, there is no better feeling in the world, but also it is where value and network value comes from. I mean, the most successful businesses of the past decade were all built on the power of networks and network effects. And I believe when you look at smartphones and the connections that we have around the world to global high-speed networks, we're going to unlock through community building some of the most valuable, creative, interesting relationships that have ever existed before. We've never had this many people connected before in terms of online digital technologies and mobile technologies. And the reality is that people have common identities and common interests and common goals in ways that enable us to build networks that have never been possible before. So that is the context for why I'm excited about thinking about how we scale communities, and we do so through the power of building networks and connecting the nodes in the network and connecting the people in such a way that we can actually do less work and see better, bigger results as community builders. One of the things that I've been really fortunate or unfortunate, depending on the room, is I've been in rooms and have made cases for multi-million-dollar investments in community building and in networks. So what are some of those decisions that people look at, whether it's an investment in a company or an investment in a platform or an investment in a specific network, and what does that look like? Well, it's really interesting. You know, one of the things I love about CMX is all of the great resources that CMX has. One of the resources or themes you see a lot is what are the business needs or what are the business value of building a community or building a network. And I just wanted to share very quickly what I have seen as the ones that really move the needle on large decisions and investment, especially for companies, especially for brands, especially for organizations. Number one is the one that I think is the lowest hanging fruit for community building, which is increasing loyalty. If you are running any kind of marketplace and you have supply and you have demand, the connections that you can create around the supply side of the business in terms of increasing quality, that obviously makes a lot of sense to have a network of those people who are actually building relationships with each other around their needs and experiences in real time at scale. That's how you can scale a marketplace in new and interesting ways. And obviously also reduce churn. So if people are building relationships with other people who are in that network, it's much more difficult to see them sort of churn out. Number two is really the ability, when you think about the power of a network, to not only connect customers to each other or connect customers and prospects to each other, but what networks enable people to do is to also connect all those people who share a common identity, but who may never buy from you ever. So when you start to think about, you know, how we've done marketing, for example, in the past, and you know, you're going to war with people. You know, if you think about the language of marketing, it's pretty interesting. It's campaigns, it's targeting, it's precision targeting, it's establishing beachheads. It sounds like you're shooting somebody to get them a message that they may not want. I would suggest that a much more effective way of building a market and creating even more value than we could possibly imagine, because that's the power of networks and that's the power of communities, is to connect all the people who share a common identity, a common interest, a common goal. And in doing so, generate new and interesting insights into what people want from you as a company, or your company if you work for one. And also where and how there are new and interesting pockets of people who may want a product or service. I lost my screen here. And then the other thing that's really interesting that we're seeing across our networks on Mighty Bell is this ability, as people are having conversations openly and freely in real time, the opportunity to really say, oh my gosh, like they seem to really be paying attention to this topic over here. And then be able to think about how not only we as a software company, but also how all the networks on our platform and the people who are hosting them, how they can actually look at tailoring their products and services for the needs and the behaviors and lifestyles of their customers or prospective customers. And this is something as you guys, as community builders and community leaders, can actually connect the dots between the network and your internal teams in some very interesting and compelling ways along these lines. And lastly, I mean, I've seen things in terms of communities and on networks that I literally could not imagine as a human being, both good and bad. But let's focus on the good. And when you think about that, it's by paying attention to communities and these networks, the opportunities for new creative thinking that you can bring to your company, your brand, your organization, just are unlocked in ways that I don't know of a better way. I mean, would you prefer to have a static focus group as opposed to building a thriving network where customer discovery and new ideas are surfaced every single day? I would argue that it's hands down one over the other. So that's great. I think we've got the value down. Great. How do you actually engineer a network? How do you think about building a community? And what we've actually seen, and I'll share with you guys something. I don't talk about community strategy for communities. or content strategy, I should say. Content to me is something that is passive. And I believe that the most compelling networks are when you are actively contributing to them and people are actively contributing to them, again, with the goal of building relationships with each other. And so we actually talk about them as engagement and engagement strategies, because the other thing that we have found is that it is not one thing. You actually have to have a portfolio of different techniques that you are using to enable these connections and for these relationships to be built. So it's not one monolithic content strategy, it's actually a portfolio of engagement strategies whose goal is to enable and activate people to contribute their stories and their experiences into a network where people share a common identity, a common set of goals, a common set of interests. And this is actually one of the things that's really important. We never, in any community that we build, use the term give advice. We always talk about share experiences and stories, not advice. And the reason is advice shuts down relationship building. It actually doesn't encourage people to contribute their stories and then other people to be able to come in and remix those stories in new and compelling ways. So how do we do this? We think about the core engagement strategies as, there's pretty much 6 of them. One, we talk about profile stories, and profile stories are first-person stories that are probably the closest thing to content, interviews. And what we've done is we've used profile stories to be able to set the context for the network. These are the people that you'll meet. These are the kinds of stories and experiences people will be sharing. And what we found is that profile stories are incredibly effective at getting people to come and stick around. Now, interestingly, people don't comment on profile stories very effectively really at all. But the time spent on profile stories, and yes, I noticed that I just touched my hair. But profile stories are really effective at saying, these are the kinds of people you will meet in this network. And they are a great way, especially if you're just getting started, to start to build that type of unique mission and point of view of your network. Action posts, this has been really interesting. The more that you have things in your network that people can take and bring into their daily life, the better off you are. It's really helpful. If you can have, for example, hey, this is what I found really works in the morning. Or one of the things that we did with Lean In is to have videos, 20-minute sort of video sessions where the whole goal was to capture on film professors sharing specific things you can do around, I know we were talking about it earlier, the likability and competence gap and what actually happens there. So really actionable things people can take away from your network gives folks the clear expectation that I'm going to get value from this, and I'm going to get value from this network very quickly. Member prompts, this is where it starts to get interesting. Simple questions. Simple questions where members can contribute their stories, their experiences, and their points of view. Really important. Polls are another way of doing prompts. So prompts basically are just text, and polls are, instant crowdsourcing of different answers. Polls also do a really great job of starting conversations if done effectively. One of the things that's great when you get to a network that is really thriving is compilation posts and surveys. So being able to say, again, you're not alone. And you're not alone when you think about you're a small business owner as a small business owner and you're thinking about social media and how much time you're spending in social media. It's not totally obvious how much time you should spend in social media. But being able to start to crowdsource the knowledge and experiences of people like you, people who share the same path, is where networks can scale in ways that if all you're doing is talking out at people and feeding it every day and hoping and praying somebody's going to talk back to you, very different, very challenging to be able to scale that. And lastly, live events, live chats, anything you can be doing to create sort of that immediacy of a live experience. What the really cool thing about live experiences as well is that they do a fantastic job of generating momentum and then also having essentially a leave-behind conversation that can happen afterwards as well. So I'm going to just skip ahead here. You know, we launched a network a few months ago called Own It, which is dedicated to small business owners and the self-employed navigating success together. And what we've been able to accomplish is 30% member contributions and continued growth. We're kind of hitting that critical mass and that sweet spot, which has been pretty fun, but I'm going to just sort of skip ahead here. You know, the mission of Own It is to create a trusted network of small business owners and the self-employed who are navigating this path together. And the promise is to be able to make better, more well-informed decisions about practical topics of self-employment, of small business owners. And one of the things that was really important is, you know, how are we measuring success? And some of in case it's helpful for folks as you're thinking about how you're presenting success to any type of stakeholders, monthly active members, with a focus on contributing members as well. So the things that we have seen work incredibly well, and again, to the extent that you guys are doing similar things, I'd love to hear about it, but the motivations for our members of Own It, you know, number one is just this power of being in the same place with thousands of professionals just like you. It's why we're here today. It's why I'm so excited to be here today, to be in a room with people who share my passion and our passion collectively for something that is so powerful and amazing in terms of engineering and building networks and communities. Then the other two are actually pretty interesting because they've been very effective for us. One is the ability to contribute and benefit from the largest knowledge base of practical information and practical stories and experiences of other small business owners and the self-employed. This notion of crowdsourcing our collective experiences is one of the things that makes CMX as compelling as it is. I would actually also argue, being in the heart of San Francisco and Silicon Valley, an entrepreneur that is doing this job today is much more sophisticated than an entrepreneur 10 years ago. Why? Because there is a network of entrepreneurs who are sharing information and practical information much faster than at any point in time than we've ever seen before. And lastly, what are the topics where networks of people who are like you the most powerful? The topics that you can't do a Google search for. The topics that are really about navigating things that don't have black and white answers. And as you think about your own communities and your own networks that you're building, the more that you're focused on those topics that you just can't do a quick and easy Google search around, I've seen much more activity, contributions, engagement than ones that it's a very practical answer of like, fill out this form. So just some examples going back to the engagement strategies. This is a profile story that we did. This just gives you a sense of what we were doing in terms of highlighting specific members. And when you're engineering a network for the first time, you can just go out to people you think are cool and be able to get them to tell their stories. And one of the things that we found is if you get them to tell their stories, they typically will also share out the existence of this new community, of this new network. So this was a great profile that we did, and then she also did a live chat for other hairdressers and makeup artists in the network, which was also very effective. So figuring out what these kind of 360 types of engagement opportunities are with members who really sort of stand out and have unique and interesting stories. This was another one that we did, so you'll start to get a feeling and vibe from it. But again, one of the things we always do with these stories is we try to have really specific action items that anybody can take away. So when we go through them, we're like, what would we do differently in our business, our startup, after reading this story? And that's a bar that has been very effective for us in terms of driving higher and higher time spent, people actually going through and reading the whole story, sharing the story out. As we shift to things like action posts, this was something that I mentioned, a morning ritual, like how to actually just write down your goals every morning in sort of the same way. That's been very effective for lots of entrepreneurs I know, but also if you're a small business owner, it's like you're setting up your day. You know, you don't have a boss. You have customers, but you don't have a boss. And so this was actually the kind of thing that we found across the board, that whenever you can provide something that is not, 5 mistakes every community manager makes, but rather, here's how to set up your day, and this is something that's worked for me, that's a really powerful, story-driven, network-building kind of technique. This is one of our kind of more successful member prompts. Very simple question, what are you going to improve this week? But think about it, if you show up and somebody asks you that kind of question, it's kind of nice. It's nice to have that reminder of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then one of the other things we found, again, in terms of scaling and starting to build those kinds of relationships with each other, is this notion of something that's more emotional, either a mistake or your greatest moment, your biggest secret, something that is more dramatic. Community questions that aren't dramatic will have no answers to them. So that's something that we've found. Polls, live chats, and I'll just finish with an observation that if you do not have a native mobile app for your community or your network, you are probably leaving about 5 times the amount of engagement and scalability of your network. And I wish those numbers were not true, but they are true. And we see them over and over and over again. And it goes mobile native apps, desktop web, and mobile web, in terms of bounce rates and in terms of time spent. Mobile web is increasingly not as nearly effective an option as native mobile apps. And I believe passionately that we need to be building more software and more opportunities for community builders like you to be able to take advantage of native mobile apps, because that is what members want. It's where they want to spend their time. The other thing that we have found is that personalization matters. So for example, so many of the platforms or software that are out there for community building, it's a little bit, especially for new members, it's a little bit like showing up in the middle of the movie. It's whatever was the last thing at the top of the feed. And what we've actually found and proven out is that personalization, where you actually create different cohorts of members, is incredibly effective at driving engagement and driving scale in your network as you're building things out, because you're taking a new member through what's the most valuable thing in this network, who are the people who are most relevant to you, and then build on that foundation over time. And lastly, if you are building a community or a network that does not have really rich data for you to be able to see what's working, what's not working, especially as you move to more of an air traffic controller, personalization, cohort way of thinking about and managing your network at scale, you're missing opportunities not only to bring great data back to your decision makers, but also to be able to make the community and the network so much more valuable to the members as well. And so, we didn't do a single A/B test at Ning, which is kind of weird to say out loud. But what we have found at Mighty Bell is that the richer and the more granular the data that we provide to the hosts of our different networks, the more effective they can build, and we can all build valuable communities for the people who are most important to us and the reason why we do what we do. So I think I've run out of time. But if there are any questions, perhaps I can take a few, and thank you.
Yeah.